So as we begin the topic of homeostasis, let's ask the question, what are the requirements to sustain human life? So what requirements have to be met so that stable internal conditions can be achieved and allow our survival or permit our survival? So we'll look at 8 necessary functions to sustain human life, and we'll discuss how those functions occur in terms of the organ systems that are involved. So first and foremost, we have to maintain boundaries. Now, maintaining boundaries is critical because we require a separate and distinct set of internal conditions, regardless of what is going on in the external world. And this ensures that the chemical reactions that sustain life can continue in a stable internal environment, even when external conditions are fluctuating. So we maintain boundaries at 2 levels. We maintain boundaries at the cellular level with the plasma membrane. So previously we've discussed a little bit of the plasma membrane's functions, and we'll continue that discussion in chapter 3. But the plasma membrane is the structure that's maintaining boundaries for us at the cellular level so that our cells can continue maintaining a very stable and consistent internal environment. So that way those cells can perform the biochemical reactions that they need to do in order to continue supporting life, right? We also maintain boundaries at the organ or organ system level with the skin or the integumentary system. So the skin is kind of the ultimate or external most of the boundary systems in the human body. So we have to maintain boundaries. And maintaining boundaries is very important for sustaining those biochemical reactions to support life. We also have to be able to produce movement, and producing movement is the function of the muscular system. So skeletal muscles, for example, we discussed move the skeleton so that we can respond to changes or stimuli in the external environment. Cardiac muscle acts as a muscular pump that moves blood through the heart and the cardiovascular system. We also see smooth muscle that lines the walls of things like the digestive system and the urinary system, and the muscle there helps to propel food if it's through the digestive system, and waste if it's in the digestive or urinary systems. The smooth muscle there helps to propel those wastes through the body and eventually eliminate them from the body. So we have to be able to produce movement to move substances through the body or to respond to stimuli. We also have to be able to respond to changes in our environment. And responsiveness is the ability to sense changes or stimuli in the environment and then respond to them accordingly. So the body uses 2 organ systems in order to communicate these changing conditions, and these 2 organ systems then coordinate the activities of all of the other organ systems in the body so that those other organ systems can respond accordingly to those stimuli or those changes in the environment. So let's look at those 2 organ systems now. So the first of these organ systems that respond to changes in the external environment is the nervous system. And on the left here we have pretty much the entire human nervous system separated out from the rest of the body here. So we've got the brain and the spinal cord here that's kind of vertically oriented. So this makes up the central nervous system. And then all these branch-like structures that you see here are the nerves that are emerging from the brain and the spinal cord. So the nervous system uses a combination of electrical and chemical signals to rapidly communicate with other cells and organs. So that's kind of a hallmark of the nervous system. It's a very rapid and direct communication system. So the nervous system sends signals to very specific places within the body. What happens, or how this occurs, is that the nervous system makes use of cells called neurons, and these neurons have a very long process on them called an axon, and at the end of an axon are these structures that store a chemical called neurotransmitters. And so what happens is that electrical signals called action potentials will travel down these neuron axons, and upon arriving at the end of the axon here, these action potentials will cause the release of those neurotransmitter chemicals from the end of the axon. The neurotransmitters will then move a short distance to another cell that is essentially on the receiving end of this axon, and the neurotransmitter then influences the cell or the tissue at the receiving end of this axon. The reason why the nervous system's responses are short in duration is that as soon as the neurotransmitter here stops being released by this neuron, the receiving cell is no longer influenced because this neurotransmitter is no longer present in the space between the neuron and the receiving cell here. So they're short in duration because as soon as neurotransmitter release stops, signaling stops. So we have the nervous system as one of the organ systems that's responsible for communicating those changes in the body. The second organ system that signals or communicates and helps the body respond to changes is the endocrine system. So in contrast to the nervous system, the endocrine system uses a series of glands that are collectively called the endocrine glands. And these endocrine glands release chemical messengers called hormones into the blood. And so what you have are cells of those endocrine glands that produce and release those hormones into the blood. The blood then carries those hormones to a specific, well, actually, the hormone is then carried all over the body, but only specific cells called target cells or target tissues will respond to that particular hormone, because target cells and tissues have specific receptors on the surface of that cell or tissue for that particular hormone. So because the endocrine system releases hormones into the blood, the endocrine system is slower to communicate because hormones have to be moved through the blood to their target cells or target organs. But once that target cell or organ or tissue receives a hormone signal, the endocrine system's effects are much longer lasting than the nervous system. We'll discuss why this is when we get to chapter 16 in A&P 2, but for now, just be aware that the endocrine system's effects are much longer lasting than the nervous system's effects. So there you have it. Those are the two organ systems that are the communication organ systems, and those communication organ systems have the responsibility of signaling other tissues or organs to respond to changes in the body, or even outside the body as well. So we also have digestion as well, and digestion is the process of breaking down ingested foods into much simpler components. So for example here, if we eat a piece of fruit, digestion will break down the carbohydrates and the starches in that fruit into monosaccharides, and the proteins that are in that fruit are going to be broken down into amino acids. And so that breakdown is giving us simpler components. And then what the body can do is use those simpler components to build new molecules. So from those monosaccharides, we can build new carbohydrates. And from those amino acids, we can build new proteins. And so digestion is necessary because it gives us the raw building blocks to make new things, to make new molecules out of, right? So when our body builds or breaks down substances, it's never a 100% efficient process. There are always waste products that are produced, and these waste products must be removed or excreted from the body. So we have excretion here, removal of wastes, right? A couple of examples here for you. The respiratory system excretes a gas waste called carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is a gas that's produced when glucose is broken down. And so every time we exhale, we're removing some of that carbon dioxide from our blood, and we're exhaling it through the air that we exhale. The digestive system is removing solid, undigestible waste from the breakdown of foods that we had just talked about in the previous slide. And the urinary system is removing nitrogen-containing waste from the blood. Those nitrogen-containing wastes are produced as a result of the breakdown of amino acids or nucleic acids. So we've got a couple of different organ systems here that are removing different types of wastes in our body. We also have metabolism, and metabolism is kind of a general term for the sum or the total of all of the chemical reactions that are going on within the body. Metabolism includes the breakdown or catabolism of substances. So catabolism gives us those simple building blocks like amino acids or monosaccharides that help us create new, more complex molecules. Metabolism also includes the creation or anabolism of substances. So that's taking those simple materials that the digestive system is giving us and building new things out of them. And metabolism also includes cellular respiration, which implies that we're using the nutrients that we're gaining from the digestive system and the oxygen that we're getting from our respiratory system in order to make ATP, or that chemical energy currency that's needed to fuel all of our metabolic processes. So yes, glucose is kind of our main sugar fuel in our body, but glucose wouldn't really be very useful to us if the energy in glucose was not transferred to ATP. So ATP is kind of our go-to for cellular energy currency. So metabolism includes breakdown, creation, and cellular respiration. So what organ systems come into play for metabolism? Well, really several organ systems are at play in metabolic processes. So the respiratory system comes into play because we need oxygen in order to create ATP. And so without oxygen, our body, it can make some ATP, but it really can't make it at the quantities that we need. And so we need a constant supply of oxygen because oxygen is part of that process in transferring the energy from glucose to ATP molecules. So oxygen is required in that energy transfer process. Okay. Metabolism also includes the digestive system, because the digestive system is breaking down those complex food molecules and giving us our more simple usable materials that we can use to build bigger things, bigger, more complex molecules, right? The cardiovascular system is important because it's delivering the respiratory gases like oxygen and the nutrients from the digestive system to all of our body's cells and tissues. And the rate of metabolism, that is the rate of breakdown and creation of substances, or the rate of cellular respiration, is controlled by endocrine glands. And so hormones, certain hormones from endocrine glands help control the rate of metabolic activities. So the main regulator of metabolic rate is thyroid hormones from the thyroid gland. So we'll discuss the complete role of thyroid hormone in the body when we get to ANP2. But just know that thyroid hormone is the main regulator of metabolic rate within the human body. All of this wouldn't be any good if we did not have the ability to create new human beings. That is, because we don't live forever, we have to be able to perpetuate our species so that way we can create a new generation to continue human life. And so reproduction is, unsurprisingly, the responsibility of the reproductive systems. So this is also an ANP2 topic, but we'll learn about male and female reproductive anatomy and how reproduction works in ANP2. But we need the reproductive systems in order to come into play to perpetuate the new species, or to perpetuate the human species and create a new generation. So another kind of secondary function of the reproductive system is that the reproductive system structures like the testes and the ovaries also produce hormones as well. So the testes produce testosterone and the ovaries produce estrogens and progesterone. So the reproductive system structures not only function in creating eggs and sperm, but they also function in creating hormones as well. So we have to be able to reproduce, right? We also have to be able to grow too. And when we imply growing, that means forming more cells. And the way that our body goes about making more cells, or the way that really any organism goes about making more cells, is through this process called mitosis, in which DNA is duplicated within a single cell, and then that single cell splits into two new cells and grows into two full-size cells from there. So this is the process known as mitosis. If this was a more general biology class, we would go through all the steps of mitosis and exactly what's happening here. But for now, really the only thing that I want you to focus on for mitosis is the fact that DNA is duplicated, and then after DNA duplication occurs, the original cell in which the DNA was duplicated then splits into two new cells. So that's how one cell becomes two cells. And that's how we ultimately grow, is that we form more cells, and then these cells get bigger as they mature as well. So when we imply growth, that's what we mean, is we mean forming more cells, and then those cells growing to a larger size, right? So to recap, what do we need for these 8 processes that are sustaining human life? We require oxygen to create ATP, so oxygen is important in aiding of the transfer of energy from glucose to ATP, and without oxygen, our body can't do that, can't produce ATP at the levels that we need to survive, and so oxygen is a critical component in being able to move that energy from the breaking down of glucose into the creation of ATP. We need water, of course, as we discussed earlier, because water is the fluid medium for the chemical reactions that support life. We also need a steady diet of consumable foods, which provide us with the raw building materials that we need to make new lipids, new carbohydrates, new amino acids, and new nucleic acids. So foods give us the raw building materials that we need to make more complex molecules. And we also need an appropriate atmospheric temperature and pressure, because the chemical reactions that sustain life really only occur within a very specific range of temperatures and atmospheric pressures. And so we need that in order to be able to keep those processes going at a rate that will sustain our existence.